Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm delighted to be chairing this afternoon's discussion titled Boom or Bust, the Economy in a Post-Pandemic World. The last 18 months have seen the state seize control of our economy. Government meddling may not be new, but the scale of it certainly is. Wages subsidised, business loans underwritten. How do we restore growth to the economy, facilitating the creation of new jobs for the new normal, and generating tax revenue to help cover the cost of coronavirus? Well, I'm delighted today to be joined by a distinguished panel of guests to help me answer some of those questions. Let me begin by introducing Deanna Davison, Member of Parliament for Bishop Auckland, staunch free marketeer, and co-chair of the Free Market Forum, a group of 65 MPs who make the case for a free economy and a free society. Our next speaker will be the gentleman with whom I share a surname by pure coincidence, we're not related. Mike Denham is chairman of the Taxpayers Alliance and a former Treasury economist who worked extensively on public spending and fiscal analysis during the 1970s and 1980s. Delighted also to be joined by Sumaya Keynes, Britain economic correspondent at The Economist. Before joining The Economist, Sumaya did research on the public finances and pensions at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and worked in the banking and credit team at the Treasury in London. And I'm joined by Matthew Lynn, financial columnist at the Daily Telegraph, but who also writes for The Spectator and Money Week. Matthew is also the founder of Endeavour Press, the UK's leading e-book publisher. And last but not least, by Stephen Herring, who is the former head of taxation at the Institute of Directors. Stephen has specialised in taxation for over 3 decades, and before joining the IOD in September 2013, was a partner in 3 global accounting firms. Deanna needs to leave our discussion a little early, so I'll let her kick off the introductory speeches, and please do bear that in mind when we open things up to the audience during the Q&A section. Deanna.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming along to this, for what I think is a really crucial discussion that we desperately need to have, and that is, you know, as we bounce out of this pandemic, what do we want our economy to look like? What is it that government and businesses should be doing to get us out of this? And from my perspective, in the most free market possible way, because it has been a tough year of a bit more state mission creep than I think any of us ever expected we would see from any government, certainly let alone a Conservative government. But I think we can all appreciate that in the middle of the COVID crisis, some of these steps were necessary, no matter how uncomfortable they may have made us feel at the time. But we're just about got COVID behind us, so it all has to be about the future and how we bounce back. And, you know, from my perspective, and I don't wish this to be a dig at my own government, because, of course, I'm very supportive of many of the things that this administration is doing. But in my view, this does not happen by raising taxes. And that is why I was one of the small band of naughty rebels a few weeks ago who actually voted against the government on the health and social care levy. Why did I do that? Well, firstly, you know, I've always believed as Conservatives, we are a low-tax party. We're not a low-tax party because of some weird ideological obsession with keeping taxes low, but we're a low-tax party because we firmly believe that individuals know better how to spend their money than governments ever will. So, come on, give me some nods, guys. Give me some feedback. Do we agree with this? Good, that's what I like to hear. We're freedom fighters together in one room. We need to band together. And that's why I think we're a low-tax party, because we believe in personal responsibility, we believe in individualism, we believe in an individual's power and ability to succeed. It's not about state intervention as the answer to everything. It's about giving individuals the tools to actually do the job for themselves. So yeah, for me, increasing national insurance at this time definitely wasn't the answer. And why do I think that? Because at the moment, as we know, the economy has not yet bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. We're doing pretty well. We saw the figures upgraded earlier this week that saw the economy actually grow a little bit faster than we thought in the first quarter of this year, which is really encouraging. Faster growth than any of the G7, which again, really encouraging, but we are not there yet. And if you ask any kind of Conservative-minded person what they would do to grow an economy, I think everyone would say we will keep taxes low and reduce the burden on businesses to give businesses the actual freedom to do business, to give them the freedom to grow. And because we know that business growth is not about abstract numbers that you see in the air, it's about what it means for individuals. It means more people in better paid jobs having the opportunity to get on in life, which I think as Conservatives who believe in aspiration is something that hopefully every single one of us in this room believes is the right approach. So that is why my vision for moving beyond this pandemic has to be about economic growth. It has to be about promoting business investment. We actually launched, when was it? 2 or 3 weeks ago, Annabelle, 30 Ideas for 2030, which was a group of MPs and peers and academics and just wonderful folk who got together to write their ideas for what the country needs to do in order to get us forward in 2030. My idea was about taxation. I know it's a very sexy topic, but it was about business taxation. It was about keeping corporation tax low, certainly not increasing it to 25%. And it was about the super deduction, which is one of those things that is so boring, but I am so fascinated by. I used to work in research and development, and one of the most excellent things I think that exists in taxation, in the taxation system when it comes to corporation tax, is the ability to kind of claim money back from the exchequer off your corporation tax because you have invested in your business. You've invested in capital. You've invested effectively in productivity. We know we lag behind in productivity compared to some of our European neighbours, and it's simply not good enough. So the government introducing the super deduction, allowing businesses to claim their corporation tax back, it's lower taxation, we love it, but also encouraging them to invest for the sake of growth, for the sake of job creation, and for the sake of our entire economic growth. So I'm excited by it. That's exactly why that was in my proposal. But I think even beyond that, we can go further because we can use that as a springboard for simplifying the taxation system completely. Because it is blooming complicated. I worked for an accountancy firm for a little while doing some advisory work and trying to get up to grips with the corporation tax system, things you can claim, things you can't claim, the fact there are so many loopholes to get you out of paying bits of tax. We don't want people paying more tax, but it shouldn't be this complicated. The cost of administering some of these taxes is nuts. So my vision for the future is that we keep corporation taxes low, we allow our businesses the space to breathe, the space to grow, the space to create more jobs, the space to invest, because as we know, when businesses grow, our economy grows, and that creates opportunities for everyone. So that is a whistle-stop tour in my head of what I think the post-pandemic economy should look like.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I think Deanna's more or less said it, so I think I might just stop there. Perhaps I could pick out a couple of points. I don't know how many of you saw Boris's interview with Andrew Marr this morning, but he laid very heavy emphasis on the fact that we are the fastest growing economy in the OECD at the moment. And according to OECD forecasts, we're going to be the fastest growing economy again next year of the G7, which is pretty good. But as Deanna said, there are a number of issues that are hanging over from COVID that are going to be very, very difficult to solve and are likely to hold back growth in the future. We're very aware of the supply disruptions that we're seeing throughout the world. We've seen prices rising, putting upward pressure on our domestic prices here. A lot of that pressure is coming from overseas. We've seen wage growth accelerating. Andrew Marr and Boris had a bit of a spat on the numbers on that this morning. I've since checked on it, and Boris is actually right. Wages, according to the ONS, have been rising, even when you make adjustments for special COVID effects, faster than prices. And those of us who remember back to the 1970s, and I'm certainly old enough to do that, will remember the notorious wage price spiral. So that's an issue. We've had a huge ramp up in debt, and a lot of it has been monetized via QE. Again, we know from past experience that kind of monetary overhang, and the numbers are really quite staggering now. QE is about 40% of GDP. That can have a very serious impact in terms of fueling future inflation in the future, the kind of thing that our old friend Milton Friedman used to talk about. So there are those issues, and of course the other issue is this productivity issue that Deanna mentioned. We've had a productivity problem for as long as I can remember, but it has certainly got a lot worse since the financial crash. And productivity in this country has more or less been flatlining since then. Something has to be done about that going forward. And just as Deanna said, at the end of the day, we need the private sector to lift productivity. Yes, there are things that government can sensibly do in terms of infrastructure spending and in terms of education spending, but at the end of the day, it has to be the private sector. And that means that we have to incentivize the private sector, give them a reason to invest more, and we have to incentivize the people of this country to, in the old cliche, to generate some enterprise and put in some effort. And there's really no way around that. And the way you do that, of course, the best levers for doing that are in the tax area. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where this government has actually increased corporation tax, as Deanna again said, and has, I mean, the national insurance rise, you can talk about it in different ways, but at the end of the day, it is a kind of jobs tax. And, you know, both of those things are steps in the wrong direction. And really, I think those of us who believe in free markets and a smaller state are dismayed by this. And you know, we look at it, and we also note that, you know, he's taken the tax burden back to the highest level in my lifetime, and the tax increase that we've just had, the two tax increases together, March and again in September, adds up to the biggest single tax increase we had since the John Major tax bombshells in 1993, and I think we probably all of us or most of us remember how that played out. So it's a huge tax increase, and taking this burden up to really what I would see as being an unsustainable level in the longer term. So what should be done from here? Well, you know, the Osborne-Cameron recipe, when they came in, has received a lot of flack, and we might come back to this in questions later on. But basically, they had an 80-20 rule for addressing their fiscal problem. They said that 80% of the adjustment was going to come from spending restraint and 20% from tax increases. We seem to have almost flipped that round the other way this time, and I think it'll be deeply damaging to the economy, and I'm very concerned about it. I'll pause there.
Hi. Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, it is. Wonderful. So I thought what I would do right now is just kind of explain some of the questions that I'm thinking about right now as kind of someone covering Britain's economy. Right. This is the big question. Are we going to go into sunlit uplands? Are we going to get a boom, or are we going to essentially be squeezed? Is this going to feel like a bust over the next year or so? So just sort of starting with where the British labour market is, right? I think it's... Oh, hello. Is the tent going to stay upright as I see? Okay. So starting where we are, right? It's worth remembering, we've heard about how debt has gone up. Clearly, spending went up a lot over the pandemic. The result of that is that actually the effects of the pandemic on the labour market were fairly, unemployment just really didn't rise as much as everyone feared it would, right? There were these real cushioning effects on the labour market. And so the question right now for economists is, okay, well, what's going to happen next, right? Clearly furlough's done now. And so what's going to happen to the remaining people who were still furloughed at the end? Now, there are some reasons for optimism. If you look at essentially Google mobility data, there's still a sense that actually there's some room left for mobility to grow a bit more, right? So perhaps there's still a bit more turn in those wheels. So if you look at retail and recreation, that's actually at its pre-pandemic level. But if you look at transit stations, workplaces, mobility in those locations is still 30% below where it was pre-pandemic. It's really interesting. If you look at cross-country comparisons, you look at Germany, France, Italy, their mobility has actually recovered to where it was pre-pandemic. Again, using this Google mobility data, not perfect, but the best we have. So Germany, France, Italy have recovered, whereas in the US and in the UK, it's actually still 15% below where it was pre-pandemic, right? So that's kind of interesting. There's kind of an open question of, is that the new normal, or does that mean we've still got somewhere to go? If you look at daily flights as well, that's, I think, still, if you look at daily flights from Gatwick and Heathrow, that's still half where it was pre-pandemic, right? We're not running at full pelt yet. Now, there are some reasons for worry. Now, since July, employers have had to pay some of the contributions in the furlough scheme, and so that should mean that employers aren't hanging on to people who they were otherwise going to fire. But there are still questions. It still could be that some of these people who are on the furlough scheme are going to be let go, and they may struggle to find new jobs, right? That's kind of, if the economy isn't doing well, if you've got lots of people who cannot find jobs, right? So there's a question of how big is that group. There was a recent report from the IFS essentially looking at, well, who are these people? Who are these people who are still on furlough? Who are the vulnerable people? And how easy might it be for them to find jobs? And so they found that actually there's a very high fraction of people in London who are still on furlough, right? And maybe that suggests that actually the economy hasn't recovered, right? City centres could still be, demand could be depressed in those places. Perhaps the economy still is undergoing this adjustment whereby demand shifts between locations as a result of people working from home. The other thing that is really striking is at the beginning of the pandemic, it was younger workers were disproportionately represented in the furlough scheme, whereas actually now it's older workers who are disproportionately represented. And that's a worry. The older workers who have been on the furlough scheme have been actually on the furlough scheme for a longer period of time than the average person. And so you really worry about their skills atrophying, right? If we think about a dynamic economy, it's one in which everyone has the opportunity to find a job. It's not just you graduates and so on. And so there, the risk for the economy is that this group of older workers essentially becomes discouraged. I think there's a statistic that that 3 months after losing a job, this group of older workers, 2/3 of those become inactive, right? They just leave the workforce. Now, maybe they're having a great time in retirement. Wonderful, enjoy that. But maybe those are people who would actually really like to work, but are just not, those opportunities have been snatched away from them. So that's another thing to worry about. Sorry, I'm using notes. I'm not like the impressive people on this panel who can talk ad lib. So I think the other I guess concern I have is that we're still in a period of uncertainty. If you look at the economy, it doesn't seem to me that we've actually worked out where we're going to shake out. How many people are going to work from home? What does this economy look like? And the fear is that in that environment, we know that businesses don't like uncertainty, and we know that when they're uncertain, they postpone investment, right? And so the question is, well, when are we going to get that certainty? When do we know? And perhaps there could be this kind of creaking start to things, and there's a question of how we get that momentum back. On this question of is working from home the new normal, it's clear that the stigma attached to it has reduced. So that's one thing. There was a survey saying about 1/5 of people never or rarely want to work from home. Right. So that suggests that there could be a really big change in the structure of the economy, but it's really unclear how employers are going to, how receptive employers are going to be to that. Now, just going to the last section of, what is there to do, right? I think actually some of the most interesting questions are not really about what the government should do, but are actually what employers should do. What should companies do? How should they handle this? I think one of the challenges when you're in a working from home environment is that management is really, really important. And this sounds really obvious and basic, but there's actually some really good research that a surprisingly large number of companies are just very, very poorly managed. You can measure this stuff, and it actually really affects output and results. There's a study of Italy showing that if you compare companies that were managed according to these particular metrics, monitoring, performance objectives, that kind of thing, they actually did better in terms of sales than poorly managed companies. And there's another line of thought that poor management is kind of one of Britain's problems when it comes to growth. Right now, I'm not saying that the government should kind of mandate management courses for companies around the country, but from a company perspective, I think that's definitely something worth thinking about. I think one of the policy questions for companies going forward is what to do when suddenly there is this new norm, right? When suddenly you're getting employees who are requesting to work from home, who are requesting flexible working. At the moment, there's this kind of strange balance, it seems, where quite a lot of discretion is being given to managers, right? There's a sense of, well, you know best, everyone's circumstances will be different. But the risk of that is that you could get very, very similar employees who are treated very, very differently, right? And then some people might complain that that's unfair, and you may get that taken to employment tribunals. So I think over the next few years, we're really going to sort of see precedents set of like what is the right way to treat different employees? What are people's rights in terms of when they're requesting this flexible working? Now, clearly, there is some stuff for the government to do. I'm not going to talk about the appropriate size of the state. I will just note that it is unusual, the position the UK economy is about to find itself in. Normally what happens during a recession is that household incomes are hammered, and then they get better during the recovery. Now, what happened in this past recession is that essentially massive government intervention meant that household income was protected, and that's a good thing, right? Essentially, the blow was relatively cushioned. But what's happening now over the next year, you've got universal credit uplift getting removed, you've got inflation pressures, right? I mean, it's not runaway inflation. I think I probably disagree with Mike in that, I don't think hyperinflation is around the corner. That's slightly mischaracterizing your view. But anyway, I'm probably a bit more relaxed about inflation in terms of long run dynamics. But you've got these pressures. You've got the national insurance increase, right? And so it's going to be a strange time when actually the economy will be opening up. Things seem like they're getting better from an aggregate perspective, but household incomes are going to be squeezed. That's a difference from past recessions, and one that I will be watching very carefully. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have a bit of a short straw going third because already said quite a lot of the stuff that I would have said. I think there's just a kind of one particular theme I'm going to talk about for 2 or 3 minutes at the time that I have, which is that I think in the kind of post-pandemic recovery, if we get one, we'll see over the next year or so, we're going to need, free market, small state, liberal ideas, probably more than ever. And I think there are 3 reasons for that. One is, I think we should be honest, intellectually, I think we've gone backwards in terms, free market liberal ideas are never particularly popular electorally. They've always been a bit of a niche audience, although quite an influential audience. But I think in the last year, they've kind of lost quite a lot of traction. We've had a partly justifiably because of the pandemic, we just had huge levels of state control, which people have got very used to, often surprisingly used to. The sort of the willingness of the population to give up their freedoms has been interesting, to put it mildly, not to say a little concerning. But that's you worry that that's going to seep out into other areas. We've seen massive increases in state spending. We've seen a kind of magic money tree mentality taking hold, which in lots of ways was maybe justifiable in the first 3 or 4 months. I think you could say, well, this is an exceptional circumstance. This is a pandemic. But we should also be worried about it, that it kind of creates the idea that there's always free money to pay for everything. And I think over the next 2 or 3 years, we should be worried that we're going to see that more and more. So I think I think that'd be my first point, is that intellectually we've gone backwards. The kind of ideas that I suspect the people in this room support have been in retreat, and it's going to be hard, and we should be focusing on that. We should be looking and thinking, well, how do we get those? How do we claw back some of that ground? It's going to be up to guys like you to do it. As part of it, the TPA and the IEA and people like that, it's going to be people on newspapers should be doing that. People in business, people like you I know you're trying. So congrats to you, but maybe a few of your colleagues need to try a bit harder as well. And broadcasters and elsewhere, and just within, local parties and within society, that we need to claw back some of those ideas that actually, slightly more freedom, slightly less government is actually okay, because I think we've retreated. The second point I'd make about why we need probably liberal free market ideas more than ever is, this was expensive. We spent a huge amount of money on fighting the pandemic. And again, you can kind of justify a lot of it. I'm not sure you can justify all of it. We had the furlough scheme figures wrapped up the other day, £70 billion. It was a lot. I was doing one piece where I was thinking, well, what else could we have done with £70 billion? We could start thinking about all the stuff the government could have done with £70 billion. It's extraordinary. We could have done some amazing stuff. But nobody was ever asking that question. It even kind of took me a little bit of a surprise, where I stopped for a minute and thought, I'm going to spend 2 minutes on Google thinking what you can do with £70 billion and coming up with a list. And it's quite impressive. But I think, my point is that this was incredibly expensive. And we always need, a decent level of economic growth, just for, society to be healthy and have all the kind of things that we want to pay for. But I suspect, we're going to need it more than ever. Over the next 5 years. The UK economy pre-pandemic was growing kind of okay, a bit mediocre, nothing amazing, nothing too terrible. But we are going to need faster growth, because I don't think we should put up taxes. I think I agree with Denham, it was a mistake to put up taxes. I think it's okay to live with a slightly higher debt to GDP ratio for 5 to 10 years. I think that's all right. If it's around 100% level, I don't think that's the end of the world. I don't think we should be driving up taxes to pay it off, but we should be paying it off with faster growth. You know, what we should be trying to do is accelerate growth. Everyone always says that, easy thing to say, but we should more than ever be trying to accelerate our growth rate to pay off all the debt that we took on, and we're probably not going to do that with higher taxes because we have a lot of history to tell us that that's not what happens. And the third point I make about why we need a bit more liberalism, a bit more freedom in our intellectual conversation is, you know, a lot of interesting things happened to the economy during the pandemic. I mean, fascinating stuff. So we all started working from home, which was really interesting. And a lot of it, some companies it didn't work out so well. A lot of companies it worked really well. A lot of people aren't going to go back to full-time home working. A lot of people, you know, because they're working from home, the city centre might go into decline. And the suburbs might boom. And my point about that was that we shouldn't, you know, it's not going to be up to people like Dana and her colleagues in Parliament. They shouldn't be telling us what to do. We have a thing called a free market, which is actually really good at change and very good at adapting to stuff and working out how things should work in the future. But I think you will see a lot of change. So it should be up to companies and staff. They can figure out whether they want to work from home, whether they want to work go straight back to the office, whether they want to do 2 days, 3 days, whether they want to work in Croatia for half the year and work in Manchester for half the year, whatever. It's up to them. You know, it's up to their employers, just an individual negotiation. But I think we might need some legal changes for that, for example. So we might need a new status of work from home person. I think, you know, employment law is very much stuck in a kind of, you know, post-war, you know, trade unions, everyone goes to the office or the factory 5 days a week model. And I think we should be, you know, one of the things we should be looking at is more freedom in employment law. That you have some kind of different kind of status of gig worker. But that's just one example of how we should just, you know, let the free market decide, let change happen, let it adapt. I think on the whole kind of suburbs, city centre stuff, we may need a lot of rapid rezoning. So if city centres, if people don't go back to the office, and they decide to work from home, well, they're not going to want to go to the Pret in the city centre, but they might want to go to Pret near their home, or maybe they won't want to go to that. Maybe they want to go to the gym or, you know, something else, but they might need different stuff very, very quickly. And we know that businesses will be fine with that. Entrepreneurs will be very, very good at reorganising things very quickly. But they need the government to get out of their way a little bit more than it. Getting a thunderstorm on that particular point. They need the government to get out of the way even more than usual. We might need rapid rezoning so that city centres, for example, might need to be rezoned for residential accommodation. There are a lot of office blocks that could be turned into housing. We know that we need a lot more housing. There might be residential areas where you suddenly say, okay, we're going to let you just have coffee shops, we're going to let you have gyms, we're going to let you have, you know, whatever it is that people want when they're taking a break from sitting at their desk being at home by themselves all day, which gets a bit boring. So I think just to sum up, you know, for all sorts of reasons, I think over the next 2 or 3 years as we recover from the pandemic and the recession that went with it, we're going to need free market liberal ideas, probably more than ever.
Well, as you say, that's what organisations like the IOT Stephen, last but not least.
Right, thank you. Actually, I did my training about 500 yards away from here, and I've always remembered the managing partner of the Manchester office where I trained, who actually became the global managing partner, which as a Manc I find totally unsurprising. He said on the first day to us, he said, don't believe people that say they're not interested in paying lower taxes because they'll lie about other things as well. Now, where we are, there's only one way that we can get ourselves out of this increased borrowing and the higher incidence of statism that there's been, and that's through economic growth. So all of our policies, particularly tax, should be focused upon making sure that we optimise our sustainable long-term growth. A tax hike is not the best way to do that. Now, let's look at the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, coming up to budget. What we don't really know yet, I know what I hope, but what we don't really know is when it comes to tax reform, is Rishi going to be a bold Chancellor or a timid Chancellor? Now, let's look back in history, not too much history, but really the last two bold Chancellors, I would argue, were Geoffrey Howe didn't look bold in other matters, looked quite the opposite. You can't sometimes tell by looking at them, you know. And Nigel Lawson, who maybe as a financial journalist people might have guessed he might have been somewhat more radical than his predecessors. I don't really think we've had on tax reform a bold chancellor since those two. So let's hope that we can have a bold chancellor. Now, many will say that the chancellor sits down in number 11 and in his offices in the Treasury on Parliament Street, and he's got the Treasury saying to him, he'll have the Treasury saying, oh, you've got to be very careful, Chancellor, because the public purse at the moment is under no end of pressure, you know, and they'll list a huge number of reasons why we can't have any form of tax cuts whatsoever. Now, the thing about the Treasury is they say that to all the Chancellors. I've got no doubt, and in fact I've heard Nigel Lawson say this, I've not heard Geoffrey Howe say this, that when they were radically reducing direct taxation from the horrendous rates which crippled our economy for decades after the Second World War, they were saying, oh, the public purse, you know, we're in a very, very big recession and we've got horrible rates of inflation that we need to bring down. We've got unemployment at, you know, phenomenal rates that we need to pay people. It's not the time now, Chancellor. Well, the Treasury are always going to say that to you. The bold chancellors are the ones that listen to that, they hear what they're saying, but then say, well, nevertheless, I'm going to do this because in the long term, I think that's right for the economy. Now, what we've got to remember about taxation is that it is globally competitive. You might get at all these international summits people saying, oh, well, we want to clamp down on outrageous tax abuse and blah, blah, blah. Yes, I mean, you know, there are some of the areas where governments have got some interests in common. But when they get back to their domestic jurisdictions, they're going to say, you know, I hear Germany's just introduced a relief. Let's have a look at that and see if we can have one that's a bit better. And they do this all the time. Tax competition between leading countries is always going to be there. Now, what we've got to make sure is that the UK is one of the winners on that. We need to win. We don't need to, I'm not talking here about getting our taxation down. I might love it to where Singapore might be or some countries in the Gulf, etc. But when we look at the leading countries, we've got to be sure that across the piece, our taxes are set at a lower level if we want the economy to succeed. And it's very important that we do that. Now, also, incentives haven't gone away just because we've had the pandemic. It still is the case that people look at, well, am I going to do this because I'm not going to take that job because I'm going to have to move to a high price area. Anyway, 42% of it's going to go in tax, maybe 43%, or top end 45, 47%. So it's people are going to look at that, you know, and they look at it throughout the income perspectives. You know, I have some guys who do some work for me at home, and they say, oh, we don't actually, you know, no, I try and make sure I keep my income below the higher rate tax threshold. So so I said, well, what would happen if the higher rate tax threshold was 60,000 rather than 50,000? So you only paid 20%. You paid 20% on an extra 10,000. I'd probably do more work. It's not. These doesn't mean these are bad people. They're not. They're just taking account of the net income and the price that they pay for that in less leisure time, etc. So incentives are a factor in the economy and won't go away, and we've got to recognise those and accept them. Now, we've also got to accept, and I think Rishi made a good start on this with the stamp duty land tax temporary relief, which I think certainly was successful in keeping the construction sector motoring during the pandemic, when it might have, you know, the opposite might have happened. And there are a lot of transactions. Now, of course, it brought forward, they might have reduced the level, but it's also brought forward some receipts, because if you don't get anything, if someone doesn't get a transaction, they don't pay a transaction tax. So it's important to look at that and not to set transaction taxes, like stamp duty, land tax, at a rate that it stops economic activity taking place. There are plenty of other areas where you want to make sure that if something's right to do for economic purposes, it's not the tax man stopping it. So that's not gone away in the pandemic either. Now, we also have a great need for simplification of our tax code, no doubt about that. And really, you can only tend to do simplification if you accept that you're going to spend a little bit of money on it by reducing the tax take for a time whilst you do that simplification. It's a price worth getting, because if you say, well, it's got to be at no cost, you create too many people who lose by the simplification, and it'll then just make you more unpopular. So simplification has a bit of a price to pay for it, but it's a price worth paying. Now, I was very disappointed in the health and social levy, because I thought that was a golden opportunity to bring some private finance in through some form of insurance arrangement. Most people are actually only in a care home for 11 months at the end of their life. We all have this vision of Granny who's 103 and she's been in there for 30 years, but that's a very small number of people. So it cries out for some sort of private insurance arrangement being used, because people do fear it, because you don't know, probably it's a good thing for other purposes that you don't know how long you're going to be in it, but so there's the fear of the having to finance that. So I think that it would have been a great opportunity to bring some private, and the state needn't be there to do everything. And if something has a cost, it doesn't mean that you have to hike taxes. And I think it would have been a very good move to look at some solutions in the private sector. Now, I'm going to just say one final thing about the tax take. What we've got to remember is that the big boys in the room, and the big girls as well, you must say nowadays, are the income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. Those collect way more than any other tax, almost, 10 times as much as the other taxes do, each one of them. So the one place you can start with tax reforms, and reforms should mean tax cuts, is with the taxes that collect the least. Now, we've got a capital gains tax, we've got an inheritance tax. Some people pay twice on the same money. If you sell something and then you're unlucky enough to die. Actually, when I was in practice, I always used to say, the problem if you die is there's a big inheritance tax liability. But for capital gains, dying is a great scheme to get out of it, because there's no capital gains at death. Not many clients. And I never wrote a letter to a client that said that one of their relatives had died at a timely point. I always said it was an untimely death, but it can be timely, looked up purely from the tax point of view. So let's focus first on those taxes like inheritance tax. I think that collects around sort of 8 or 9 billion, and capital gains about 10 or 11 billion. Income tax is about 175 billion the last time I looked. So let's focus at the small taxes and start off and put our marker down that we're going to simplify taxes, reduce the number of taxes, make them fairer, and that's the marker for the future of the way the Conservative Party should retake the mantle as being the party in favour of tax cuts.
Promising to abolish business rates, to introduce an office of value for money to review government spending, and of course the civil war that erupted on supporting the minimum wage increase to £15 an hour. So my question, which I will put to Deanna first, is there a risk that Labour might become, or be perceived as, a more welcoming home for those interested in economically sound policy?
Well, the business rates thing that Labour announced, I really hope we follow suit or go even further, to be honest. I think there's been a massive push certainly amongst our membership, but also my own constituents, businesses, saying this is a completely unfair tax. It's massively outdated. We need something much better. We can look at interesting proposals like a turnover tax or something, but business rates is not the way to go. So it's probably the one thing I'd give Labour praise for that came out of their conference. I certainly won't be praising Sir Keir's speech too much, which I don't know if you guys caught it, but that is 88 minutes of my life I will never get back. But no, I think against that backdrop, you also have sort of economically illiterate calls from the Labour Party to fund absolutely all their spending proposals through a 1% wealth tax, which we know is not going to blooming work for all the reasons that you highlighted just then, Stephen, about the actual tax take. We know national insurance, VAT, and income tax are the biggies, as you rightly highlighted. And I'm kind of astonished that they think a 1% wealth tax or a wealth tax on the top 1% of earners would pay for absolutely everything. It is the new version of a magic money tree, I think. So, no, I think for now, we Conservatives are still the party of lower taxes, which is apparently what we're supposed to say these days, but I don't want us to be the party of lower taxes. I want it to be the party of low taxes, as we always used to be, and hopefully we can get back to that point. And I'm really sorry with that, I'm going to have to dash, but thank you all so much for your very warm welcome.
Matthew, you spoke earlier about the Overton window swinging to the left. What's your response to my earlier question?
Well, I guess it's slightly worrying that you can even ask the question. The Labour Party shouldn't be, the party of lower taxes and more friendly to business than the Conservative Party. I think, the truth is it's gone backwards. It hasn't been, they haven't quite seized the opportunity. We'll just have to see how it plays out. I can't really see a Keir Starmer-led Labour Party particularly filling that space. I suspect it's just rhetoric, but there is a lot of space there. And obviously, the current government hasn't been doing enough on that. I think actually one of the things they could have done, which would have been really interesting, is actually use the pandemic to reassess. A lot of the speakers have talked about how ridiculously complex and outdated our tax system is. Business rates, but also many other taxes. One of the really interesting things the Chancellor could have done was said, we've got this huge increase in spending because of the pandemic, and I think most people support that. Let's actually spend a year totally redoing the tax system from a blank sheet of paper. And coming up with a modern tax system. There was lots of radical space to do better stuff, and I think a lot of the things that they've actually done, just putting up corporation tax again, putting more on national insurance, have been very disappointing.
Yeah, so the UK tax code is now around 10 million words compared to Hong Kong's 200,000. But with that, I will put questions to the floor now. If anyone
can I just say one thing?
Oh,
first,
absolutely.
You're not just looking that way, are you?
No.
Yes, some of you on this question, some of you may have seen the poll in today's press that TPA were involved in, which basically shows that fewer people now trust the Tories to keep their taxes down than they trust Labour, which is a truly shocking thing. I'd be pretty sceptical about Labour, but that's another point. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I also agree with Dan not to put taxes up. It's the easiest thing. It was the easiest thing to do, and I think there should have been, like you said, Matthew, a time of pause and reflection, not only to look at what tax reforms they could do, but maybe looking at a tax rate on the banks, say 10%, increasing the 15% that Amazon now has to pay worldwide, maybe up to 20 or 25%. But then also looking at cutting costs, which is also a very hard thing to do, especially when people now have got to pay a lot more money on energy rises. So, take, for example, my council tax bill, 9.1% this year is going to the Police and Crime Commissioner's budget. Their budgets are totally out of control. And there should be a lid on council taxes, for example, moving into next year, so people won't be having to pay extra, especially with the energy taxes. So my main question is, what about a tax raid, a one-off tax raid, rather than take the easy route, which Rishi unfortunately did, and just raise taxes?
Sure. Stephen, would you like to come back on this one?
Yes, the issue tends to be with the one-off raid that nobody believes it's a one-off. And if it's successful, typically chancellors on the left think, oh, well, that seemed to go all right, why don't we do that again? I mean, income tax was introduced on a one-off basis to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. It was actually then, when the First Revolutionary War ended, it was repealed and then reintroduced when Napoleon got going. It's not been repealed since. I wasn't around at the time, by the way. So that's the problem, that one-off taxes tend to carry on and and not become one-off and just become part of the system. So I think the other areas you were talking about of looking where costs should be cut should be the top of the agenda, because I'd fear with a one-off that people would copy it. I mean, there's been some, one of the things that I do remember is when Dennis Healy, he was looking for some unpopular groups, and he came up with property builders and property developers, or speculators as he called them. And he introduced a 100% tax, believe it or not, on the increase in value of housing land. There was a 100% tax called development land tax, introduced at a concessionary rate of 80%. And he said to capture that for the public. The problem was that it was very popular at the time. You told people, oh, that's a good idea, that these people should pay. But when people saw the consequences, like the supply of housing land simply dried up. And the consequences of a new tax tend to be very unpopular, even if there's a moment in time when the public might think it's a good idea.
Sime, I wonder what your thought is, and whether, as a journalist, you're hearing the government at all talk about making meaningful cuts to government spending, or do you think that so much of the debate is really around whether we're going to raise taxes, and if so, which taxes and when?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big fiscal event coming up is the spending review, right? So spending cuts are going to be, they're going to be the topic. I mean, I guess. So the thing that strikes me is that often in this kind of tax, borrowing, spending debate, you can't really have high spending, low taxes, and low borrowing, right? That's just. There's three sides of the triangle. You can have two, but not all three. And often, I guess one of the frustrations about some of the debate is that people think that you can have all three. And so I guess, if we're calling for lower taxes, if one wants to call for lower taxes, then, and one also believes in fiscal rectitude, then you need to identify which bits of government spending you need to cut, right? And the reality is that we've just had quite a few years of fairly tight spending. The shape of the state has changed in fairly fundamental ways. The NHS as a share of departmental spending has grown a lot. Spending on pensioner incomes versus the working age population, that's also grown, right? And sometimes, to me, watching this debate, it's not at all clear that was a decision that was made kind of on its merits to start with. And whether actually part of that was just a decision that, there are these areas, they're very, very heavily politicized. These are political interest groups. And so they need to increase. And let's just not talk very loudly about the other areas that are getting absolutely slashed, right? And so I'm possibly the lone wolf on this panel, and kind of wanting, I guess, a bit more discussion of, one can say, there's lots of wasteful spending, and I'm sure there is some wasteful spending by the government, but also there are some really, really severe spending pressures, right? We have a demographic change in this country. The population is getting older. People have certain expectations about the state pension they're going to receive. There is a welfare system where we think it's a good idea to provide, certain levels of income support to the working age population. There are public services that are really important, right? That is a good idea for society to provide, right? So you can't just kind of wander into a supermarket and then start complaining that the apples are too expensive, right? You can say the apple should be better quality, but you need to talk about the quality of the apple. You can't just complain that the prices of things are too high. I think there needs to be more of a debate about what we're paying for, and it's not just one side of the ledger. And I know there's a very conversation, and Mike's kind of grinning at me. So Mike, take it away. Tell me about all the wasteful spending that needs to be cut.
I mean, the TPA, obviously, it's our bread and butter is trying to identify wasteful spending inside the public sector. And, we think we do identify quite a bit on a regular basis. And also, I take Samaya's point completely. that, you know, we need to have an honest discussion about this. And I agree that it's very easy to say, well, you know, we'll just cut taxes and we'll think about some areas of spending and we might need to buy and not have a proper discussion. Absolutely agree with that. And I think we do need to have, personally, I think we need to have a serious longer-term discussion about how the government delivers public services. I mean, for example, in healthcare, you know, we've just put this additional chunk of money into the NHS, and we can all see the reasons why we've done that to try and make good for the problems through the COVID period. But, you know, we also remember what happened back in the early noughties. A huge amount of money was put into the NHS by the Blair-Brown government, and a big chunk of that essentially went into cost inflation. You know, salaries went up, and great if you're working in the NHS, but you know, we didn't get the bang for the buck. So we need to have this proper discussion about, for example, how we're going to deliver healthcare in this country. The problem is, as we all know, that is such a toxic subject because, as Nigel Lawson pointed out years and years ago, you know, the NHS is the closest thing we have to a religion. And so no government really feels kind of empowered to have that debate. And that is a problem. But that rationally is what we need to do. We need to have those sorts of discussions. So I'm not really disagreeing with you on that. We need to be rational about these things.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. Hello. So productivity was mentioned earlier. So although successive governments have thrown money at things like apprenticeships, our education system is still very much designed to funnel people towards university. Do you think the Blairite insistence on getting everyone to do degrees that in many cases are useless, do you think that's contributing to our productivity problem? And if so, do you think we should reduce the number of universities or university places that exist in this country?
Matthew, would you like to come back on that one first?
Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, you know, my starting point was it's not really up to the government to decide, you know, how many university places there should be. Actually, people should decide that for themselves. I mean, I think the trouble is we've had, you know, too much of a state-directed system. We've had a slightly odd system where the government kind of funds education, kind of funds these borrowing machines, which then go into university. Actually, I mean, I suspect it's going to be very interesting with the increase in real wages, which I think is going to be fascinating over the next sort of 2 or 3 years. We're just seeing the start of that process with slightly lower levels of immigration. We're seeing accelerating blue-collar wages, particularly, you know, we're seeing a lot about truck drivers, but I think you're going to see it much more broadly. And I suspect that may actually fix the problem. We may actually tip the balance. That a lot of, you know, as you say, when you get up to 50% or so of people doing degrees, some of it was a bit marginal. For some individuals, but I think it's best for individuals to decide. But there may well be some people who think, you know, do I need 60,000 of debt for a degree which is not that great, it's not going to get me a fantastic job, or would I be better off, you know, doing a trade? If I can earn 50, 60,000 driving a lorry, maybe I'd be doing that. But I think, you know, the important thing is really to let individuals and companies decide for themselves. It's not up to us to decide what's a useless. We got no idea what kind of skills are going to be needed in the 2030s or 2040s. It's up to individuals to decide it for themselves.
And I found that the school was all interested in having somebody who was there going to just push their students into universities.
No, well, I agree with that. I mean, I think there has been a lot of pressure to increase the size of the university education, and I think we should step back. But I don't think we should step back too much in the other direction. I think we've been pushing people too much. We've been trying to shape society, and it never works out very well.
But that's not the only thing, right? The thing is, there isn't very much else that the students could have been directed to, because the apprenticeships and the jobs that they were going to, they probably don't exist. That might be the other problem. And I think that is a problem that you're facing as a panel, because if you're going to pursue a policy, financial policy, tax policy, which then in that case, you need to be thinking, what is it that we're aiming to do? I used to work in the tax office myself, and we had only 26 tax inspectors for some sort of transaction tax, which actually concerns Facebooks and Googles and all those, whereas 500 tax inspectors were employed in the US for the same thing. And we were not collecting any money because of that. So there are tax issues in terms of how the government actually taxes. You know, somehow, I don't know how, the government has been really negligent on this. That's why we've not been getting taxes from Facebook and Google. You know, we've been getting in tens of millions maybe, but not the huge amounts that they're generating from the economy that they're operating here.
Thank you. I'd just like to sort of stay a little bit on topic here with the productivity puzzle and come to you, Mike, and see what, there's a reason why it's been called a productivity puzzle, but what do you believe some of the solutions are?
Well, it is a puzzle because nobody really understands it, and we might as well be open and honest about that. I mean, those of us on the free market right, if you like, strongly believe that the private sector is key to this. It's quite clear when you look at our economy, look at the overall stats, that our level of investment has been some way lower, not just in capital equipment, but also in R&D for some considerable time. And, there are things that could be done, I think, on the tax side to incentivize that. And one of the things you do, of course, is not increase the rate of corporation tax as we've done. So, I mean, the private sector is key to it. What can the government actually do in terms of this spending? Well, as I mentioned, I think there are things the government can do sensibly in terms of infrastructure spending. Some types of transport spending obviously makes sense. I mean, the TPA is we have a very clear position. We're against the HS2 project as it stands. But there are other types of transport projects that do make sense. And Ben Houchin was talking about some on the radio as we were driving up here in his area. So, there's a transport infrastructure. There is obviously things like, and everyone talks about this, ultra-fast broadband is something else that can be done. On education, the first job I had on leaving university was actually as an economist at the old Department for Education and Science. And, we did a lot of work on cost-benefit analysis of various types of education and various levels of education. And at that time, it did seem fairly clear that putting more public money into higher education made some sense. But of course, at that time, we had far fewer students. And I think that I sort of agree with the basic point that this has gone too far. It sounds like a good idea, but just pouring money into these educational facilities and just increasing the throughput doesn't necessarily deliver much in terms of productivity. So education is a bit of an issue, I think. There are other things that can be done, and one of the big things that can be done, of course, is deregulation. And, this government has made a lot of promises in terms of deregulating the economy. And one of the attractions of coming out of the EU was supposed to be that we could have a big program of deregulation right across the economy and really reap the benefits of being beyond the grasp of Brussels, as it were. However, that really hasn't happened to any extent, and instead we've got some fairly major green policies coming in, and different people have got different views about these green policies, but they are going to be a huge drag on the economy, I think, over the next few years, because we're directing the segments of the economy into areas where we're dealing with expensive technology and, in many cases, unproven technology. So that's not a terribly clear answer, but there we are.
I'll let Stephen have the final word on this because I know that you're keen to come back, but just quickly because I'm conscious that we are running out of time,
just
unfortunately.
Very quickly on the productivity angle. It's clear that we need to focus on that because we do come out below the likes of France and Germany, even Italy, I believe. But there is another dimension to it. I mean, I use the term agility. We've had a more agile economy, and what we want to get better, one way to get better productivity is to force a couple of million people out of work. They'll be at the bottom end, and our productivity will shoot up because of the way it's measured. I think if Disraeli relied today, he'd say there are lies, damn lies, and productivity statistics. So I think it's very important that we keep hold of and improve our agile economy, which enables people to start new businesses, to work in a more flexible manner according to how they want to, the hours they might want to work on a contracting basis, 0 hours basis if necessary, if that's what they want to do. Now, the problem is there's a lot of people in the press, in the media, indeed in the professions that I'm a member of, and that look upon that as somehow less good than the traditional model of working, and also say, well, just a minute, it's got some tax advantages. We should look to eliminate those tax advantages that the flexible economy has. Well, why not actually bring the inflexible economy into line with the flexible economy, because it seems to be doing better by cutting the taxes on the inflexible economy. So I think it's we've got to be very careful just on focusing on productivity alone, because the UK economy has been more successful than some of our near neighbours, despite its lower productivity. We want to improve the productivity, but not throw the baby of agility out of the bath at the same time.
Fantastic. Well, that just leaves me to thank everyone in the audience for joining today, to thank our panellists for their time and their excellent insights, and to encourage you all to come to the events over the rest of our programme over the next few days. We have posters in the tent just over there, or you can follow the IEA and TPA on Twitter to find out more. Thank you very much.